Okay, good evening. Good evening and welcome. Can you all hear me okay? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up? Okay. Medium? Medium, okay. Good evening again. My name is Igor Marjanovic, and I have the great pleasure and honor to serve as the Dean of the Rice School of Architecture, and also to welcome you tonight to our public lecture by Sara Zewde, whose critically acclaimed design practice is a form of hybrid practice that fuses together landscape architecture, urbanism, and public art. Sara is also a faculty member at Harvard University and has previously taught at Columbia and the University of Texas. She holds a Master of Landscape Architecture degree from Harvard University, a Master in City Planning from MIT, and a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. Whoever claims that statistics is not creative or a good foundation for design practice, I guess they're wrong, right? So it's a very interesting background. Her work has been widely published and also exhibited, including at the 2016 and 2018 Venice Biennale in the Brazilian and the US National Pavilions. Sara merges design and critical thinking by challenging precedents and typologies that we too often take for granted. She connects the multiple dots of our shared history to create new narratives that straddle racial and design history, including slavery, public park systems, and collective memory. Her projects fuse ecology and craft to create new openings and design paradigms, and perhaps raise one key question, which is, what does it mean to design with a dual lens of both culture and climate today? Or, since Sara is also a native Houstonian, so welcome home, Sara, we can rephrase that question to ask in this way: what does it mean to design with a lens of multiple cultures that are trying to navigate each other and also a context of climate collapse? We are delighted to hear Sara Zewde's thoughts on these time-sensitive questions, and are very grateful for her participation, and we wholeheartedly welcome her back to her hometown. Her lecture will be followed by brief remarks and a response by Assistant Professor Maggie Tsang, who will also moderate the Q&A session thereafter. So in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Sara to the podium. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you. Thank you for that amazing introduction and for hosting me with such open arms in my hometown. I do a lot of this, but rarely have the home court advantage, so I'm really excited to be here. And in fact, I'll present my work in a way that I never have before. I think the prompt of being here in Houston has made me reflective about the journey of my practice and my work. And so I'll present it in a way I never have before, which is to take a bit of a biographical approach and talk a little bit about the journey of practice and not just who I am as a moment in time, but how I got here, because Houston plays a big role in that. So it is true, I was born here. I was born here in the medical center, maybe a mile and a half from here. A couple people in the audience were there. I went to Montessori school around the corner from here. Actually, one of my classmates from preschool is here. And you know, the journey of, so at 12 we moved to Louisiana, and then we returned back at 4 we moved to Louisiana, and at 12 I moved back to Houston, but always along this Gulf Coast. And I went to college not knowing what I would major in, and then I watched this storm from my dorm room in college, which, you know, really set me on my journey, my intellectual journey towards finding the disciplines and the literature that would help me understand the set of ecological and political, infrastructural factors that could manifest a Hurricane Katrina and all the subsequent storm events and aftermaths. And so that journey was a long one. It included statistics, which is absolutely an art, not a science. And sociology and city planning, and finally landscape architecture. So I did take the scenic route, but I do also feel that all of these lenses of inquiry and of knowing are important to what we do, which is reading places and projecting into them. So to share a little bit with you about what those inputs have been along the way. They include, for instance, a notion of the aesthetic of being. This is a phrase that Bell Hooks, a cultural writer, references in an essay called An Aesthetic of Blackness. And what she's writing about is something that I relate to wholeheartedly, which is that design wasn't spoken of in her home, in her household growing up. And yet there was an observation on her part of what she called an aesthetic of being, a practice that people have of their everyday lives in making and using space. And in their use of space and in their life ways, it is a form of design, and is a form of design that we as architects should understand as precedent and as creative departures for contemporary practice. And particularly in view of the fact that many lifeways and cultures are underrepresented in our canon. And a notion of memory and identity. Toni Morrison's essay, Sites of Memory, is a very important input in my intellectual formation. And reading more about neuroscience as well, and the relationship between memory and identity. If you have a traumatic head injury, the first thing they do to understand whether you have your memory is to ask you if you know who you are. And that is because your identity is a function of the accumulation of your past. You are what you have been. And for us to talk about sense of place and understand the places that we are working in, we have to know what they have been in order to understand what they are and can be. And so, what may appear a preoccupation about the past or history is in fact an inquiry on the present and the future. And the idea of places as ideas. This book called Harlem is Nowhere, written by Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, another native Houstonian. She writes about whether Harlem, the neighborhood in New York where my office is based, is a real place or an idea. And the book grapples with that without answering it in a very productive way. And for me, it is very parallel with the way I work in any context, which is to say that places mean things to people. And whether you're designing parking lots in Houston, which I did, it is part of my professional journey, that parking lot or that median means something to someone, and that it is our responsibility to understand places as ideas. And so, in my current work, I both have a professional practice. Studio Zewde is a landscape architecture firm, full service, based in New York City. Conduct research, I teach, exhibition, curation, and writing. And all of these activities are not separate activities, but they really are feeding off of one another, compounding in kind of a dialogue, a dialectical feedback loop between these various modes of inquiry around those central questions that I've outlined. Many of these inquiries take place in the studio in Harlem, New York, and that relationship to the place or the idea that we are situated is an important one there in Harlem neighborhood. We describe our work in the office as having a design methodology that syncs site interpretation with cultural narrative and a dedication to the craft of construction. That is to say that these ideas are not marketing ideas or ways to talk about projects, but we believe in them in a way that influences every step of the design process. So, all the way down to the detail scale. We don't have a details library in our office. Rather, we really develop a narrative framework that translates into things like material hierarchy, or help us make decisions about how, the expression of a material, because it is at that scale that people feel like they belong in a place, and a place feels like it belongs in its context. So with this methodology, we are able to work across scales, across project types, and across geographies. I don't do this work by myself. Everybody in the office brings a very unique piece of the puzzle to the project. You know, we have backgrounds as disparate as theater design and lighting design to community organizing, to art history. And, you know, at the end of the day, we are coalescing these ideas into built landscapes, but the structure of the office is really meant to absorb what people bring to the work in the direction of the overall methodology. So as I mentioned, I'm going to describe a few projects or share a few projects that cut across some practice and research verticals, if you will, but I'll do so in a sort of chronological way, biographical way, to share about the journey of really coming from here and somehow ending back here today. This is a project that I was working on while I worked for a small landscape architecture firm here in Houston. And the project was a simple one in theory. It's Genesee Street in the 4th Ward, known as Freedmanstown originally. And you know, the idea here was essentially that there was a street that required some stormwater work, and the civil engineer subcontracted to the landscape architect. And I was staffed on the project. So I'll describe a little bit about the project and where things took a turn. As you may or may not know, the architecture here in Freedmanstown is what's known as shotgun architecture. Everybody's like, yeah, great. I'm glad to know that that's part of the curriculum. And it's the establishment of the community has a particular relationship to Buffalo Bayou, knowing that, you know, upon emancipation, people settled along the Buffalo Bayou on this piece of land that hadn't been settled, in part because of how difficult the landscape conditions were. It was very it was flooding, the soils were very clay, very thick vegetation. And so that little spot remained open, and ultimately the people of what would be known as Freedmanstown settled here. Ultimately, the community would be the civic heart of Black Houston, home to teachers and shop owners, doctors and lawyers. And the neighborhood would meet a similar fate as many communities in the urban core across America. You know, things like the bisection of the neighborhood because of freeway construction, the removal of homes to build public housing, and redlining, and as of late, the intense development pressure given its proximity to downtown Houston. So this, you know, was the street, Genesee Street, that was slated for some stormwater work. And, you know, they hired the landscape architects to do what most people think landscape architects do, which is to say where to put the trees. And they said, given the history of the neighborhood, maybe we could have some African symbols in the paving, or, you know, they're like, oh, maybe a statue. And at the time, I was really trying to shake the idea that, you know, design could do more than that in this context. And so my boss at the time let me go off and try something, and I did. And where I started was to think about the evolution of the architecture itself. Its Yoruba antecedent has a very strong relationship to the street. It's, you know, the architectural antecedent was brought to Haiti by enslaved people, following which, you know, during the Haitian Revolution, a lot of people fled to Louisiana, which was also French-speaking in the 19th century. And this form then spread through the bayous of Southeast Texas and lands here in Freedmanstown. And among the things that are distinct about the architecture are the fact that the short end of the home faced the street, and that you have this kind of gallery of spaces created by the porches, windows, and doors. And that kind of alignment and ubiquity of these features offers this space that's neither public nor private, but encapsulates the most intense and complex memories of home in this neighborhood. And so, you know, while some of these structures remain, I started to just take photographs of them at different times of day and seasons, really looking at the patterns created by these features. And if you take a look at the brick paving, again, these bricks were made by the people of Freedmanstown. The city of Houston itself would not build the streets for them. So along the straightaway of the streets, the pattern of bricks is orthogonal, and that breaks in the intersection, and you see these kind of this diamond form. And the elders in the neighborhood describe that as a ritual brought from West Africa, that to mark the intersection as a space of ritual. And so what I proposed was that the streetscape itself do just that. It collect and aggregate the salvageable bricks in the intersections to mark them as a space of ritual. The school here wanted a site wall, and instead of a site wall, I proposed this pattern of concrete walls. The color and the material, a bit modest, in part because of budget, but also to speak to the modesty of the original structures themselves, with these cutout windows and doors speaking to that pattern that is so closely associated with people's memory of the neighborhood. And this is modeling the shadows and patterns created by those cutout windows and doors. And I proposed casting the walls with the wood panels from the homes as they come down, so that the panels themselves become a grain of that memory. And instead of off-the-shelf benches, that the porches themselves would offer public seating, in the sense that as opposed to having a plaque describe what this neighborhood used to be, that the design of the public realm itself can provoke that memory. And the planting palette then also becomes a way to not only create this cooling microclimate in the hot Houston heat, but also tell the story of the bayou and its vegetation with which the community lived. And so through this early project, one of the takeaways for me was really about the medium of the public realm and the ways in which lighting, planting, paving, all these kind of banal elements of our everyday life can tell stories. And we don't have to sit around and wait for a memorial commission or a public art commission or what have you, but everything that we build, even if it is a curb or a street tree, has an opportunity, or a bench, has an opportunity to tell a story. And in this case, the lighting is this kind of warm yellow light that's backlights the panels in a way to animate the street and again, tell those stories. So continuing on the life journey, I started to get involved in 2010-11 with a project in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a project that I still remain involved in. I just returned in January from there. And a lot of those inquiries from the Genesee Street Project continue through this work. Rio de Janeiro was the place where 22% of all enslaved Africans brought to the Americas passed through. So it is a site that is important, for global history, not just Brazilian history. And the Cais do Valongo, the port of Valongo, was the place where the people's feet first touched the Americas. This is a view from the Bay of Guanabara, the year that slavery was abolished. So what you see here is the historic coastline of Rio de Janeiro, and this green area here, which was the Valongo Wharf, right where their feet touched the Americas for the first time. Given a number of landfilling operations, that wharf was entirely removed from view since abolition until 2010. With the World Cup and the Olympics and a lot of the infrastructure upgrades that were made to this part of town, they actually found the wharf perfectly preserved 6 feet below the street. So there's a question about what to do with this, and the mayor was in the newspaper saying that they were going to build a memorial that represents the Black experience in Brazil, and I got a research grant to basically ask him, what does that mean? And, he didn't know. And he said, do you have any ideas? So that's how I got involved. And walking into this project, I had to really take a step back and reflect on the idea of the memorial over the course of architecture. The idea of the memorial is really embedded in classical notions of monumentality. And that over time, that has translated into various architectural forms, but the spatial traditions of the memorial are still rooted in that sense of overwhelming the scale of the human body and regulating speed and sound and a kind of sense of guilt and sadness around memorial. And so, we come into the contemporary chapter of memorials, and again, they become abstracted. They're on the, they lay horizontal. They do all of these, but ultimately they invoke the same kind of sense of space. And these ideas are really fashioned around the idea that memorials are about an event, a discrete event, or a person, a hero, a tragedy, a triumph. But slavery was not an event. It was 400 years of the way the world operated, and it would suggest a different architectural form. So what I started to do was map the site over 300 million years and found that the site actually touched the southwest coast of Africa, this site being the Valongo Wharf, and touched the coast of Africa, which means that its soil profile is actually quite similar. And so many of the plants, the seeds that people brought to the Americas hybridized and flourished in the new land. So this is kind of zooming into the Valongo Wharf. The gray lines represent the transatlantic slave trade routes. The red represents the latisolic tropical red soils. That was one landmass. You see Houston firmly a part of this whole complex. And the hatches represent the movement of plants and culture as it relates to those soil types. And again, Rio and the Valongo Wharf situated at a very important point in this system. So this is a mapping of the industry of slavery in around the Valongo Wharf. There's a large ship that comes to the wharf. There's a skiff transfer. If you're alive on arrival, you are taken to this plaza known as the deposit, where there's taming and fattening for 2 to 4 weeks before you are sold. If you're dead on arrival, you're taken to this open burial ground. If you're sick on arrival, there's a slave hospital. And the warehouses that line these streets are the place where you are kind of stationed for 2 to 4 weeks during the taming period before you go to one of the plazas for your sale. What this reveals is, what it requires to buy and sell and ship millions of people. It requires a city. And so the city, the construction of the city is really the memorial to slavery. This is really about repositioning the project away from the discrete memorial, the names on the wall, but really thinking about the city as the memorial. So the bottom layer is that historical analysis. The second layer is the contemporary city and mapping onto it how many of those plazas and buildings and streets are still there. They're virtually all still there, and with no sign, right, of their history. And on the top layer is the parcels that the city currently owns. And so I came back to the mayor's office and said, I know you asked me to design a memorial, but I have another idea, and that is, that we should be thinking about a kind of a regional plan for memory. So this is a system of notation and diagramming. It's become a part of my practice overall of documenting the ways in which memory lives in the everyday life of the spaces around here. So where the memorials don't say anything, the built environment doesn't speak to this, people and their use of space do, right? Their aesthetics of being. So this is a series of just notation, these dots representing bodies and the ways in which affoché, candomblé, the planting of the various vegetation that was brought from Africa, all of that comes together to tell these stories in ways that design may work to amplify if it can readily identify it. So I presented this kind of plan, this strategic plan for a series of memorials that weave into the everyday life of the city. Each one of them representing its own capital project, and each one engaging and using the Afro-Brazilian plant species. They're considered non-native species. However, sharing that mapping with city officials, I was able to kind of open up a dialogue about that. You know, this idea of native plants is really kind of based on an arbitrary moment in the constant migration of plants. It's basically, you know, saying which plants were here when Europeans arrived, and everything before that is considered native. And so opening up the conversation about the cultural value of plants and how they actually perform here, they actually relaxed this policy for the sake of this project. Just to go into how these projects hit the ground a little bit, the ficus genus is a genus that's native to both continents, and West Africans and Afro-Brazilians believe that the base of the ficus is where the ancestors gather, and they mark that with a wrapping of white walls or white fabric. And so I wanted to translate that into a form that could help create a series of site furnishings, but also form a circulation system and a formal language around the entire circuit of memory. So this is around the archaeological site of the Valongo Wharf, as opposed to this kind of box form of the archaeological site, a kind of blurring, that using that ribbon form to blur the edges represents a blurring of past, present, and future, and city and archaeology. And this is, you know, how that translated into a suite of site furnishings, planters and benches with inscriptions, and really highlighting all of the Afro-Brazilian vegetation that's already there. This is a paving pattern and a lighting system developed for the streetscape to talk about how the street was not only were a coastline at once, but actually touched Africa. And so this is about a formal paving pattern that is kind of a zipper language to talk about the continents pulling and pushing. So, you know, each of these spaces is, again, it's really about amplifying what's there, highlighting what's there. This is the installation of this tree, this baobab tree, which is a really important Afro-Brazilian tree. And the project, as I mentioned, is ongoing. This project in particular is about advocacy. And that's really started to shape my thoughts about the role of the architect as an advocate. So those questions were lingering as I started to form my practice. So this was a competition that we did not win, but it's based in Houston, and it was one of our earliest projects. And so you'll start to see how advocacy starts to emerge as I'm trying to figure out professional practice and its relationship to advocacy in architecture. This is, again, really citing the project in the history of the bayous. The competition was to memorialize Barbara Jordan at the Gregory School. She's from the 5th Ward originally, but the brief was to memorialize her legacy at the Gregory School, the first public African-American school in the state of Texas. And so, you know, what really brings the 5th Ward together with the 4th Ward and a lot of historic African-American communities in Houston is the relationship to the bayous. So these are some images from the U of H archives of some early baptisms at the bayou. And the notion of gathering around water being central to this legacy. And the ways in which institutions and schools and entire communities came from this tradition and then spawned the Barbara Jordans that we know. But rooting in that legacy of the land became our approach to designing this. So this is, you know, I think one of the things you'll start to gather is that original idea of memory and identity. And so before we even start to talk about form, the depths of research of the Institute, for instance, or the land. And the 5th Ward was one of these communities that emerges, and Lyons Avenue and the stretch of a black commercial corridor that was thriving is important to situate in a conversation around a Barbara Jordan. The tradition of the church and the involvement, the pivotal, central role that the Black church plays in this. And then we can understand a Barbara Jordan rising from these histories. So this is us mapping the history of the bayous alongside the history of Barbara Jordan, and really understanding for ourselves the relationship between the land and the people. So this is another mapping of that. Again, the 5th Ward, the 4th Ward, and seeing them as a part of the same landscape relative to Buffalo Bayou. So we dug up some archival drawings of the Gregor Institute. You all probably know it now as a library, but the original, which is situated here, I'll share that in a minute, but its original siting of the Institute is to the left here, which is west. So this is an aerial from 1953 and 2019. This is the footprint that you all might be aware of. So where the original building was is just an open lawn. And the competition allowed each entrant to define for themselves where they would intervene, and we proposed that based on those archival drawings. So this was the site plan that we proposed, and I'll share a little bit about how we got there. Barbara Jordan talks about the soil and the spirit of Texas, and the feeling that I as an individual can accomplish whatever I want and that there is no limits. That quote for us really resonated with the way that we understood her legacy as well, that it is this, literally the soil from which she rises. And for her, looking back at her a lot of what she's written and spoken, she was very prolific. She talks about education being the key, and education uplifting her and taking her ultimately to the heights that she did. And so what we understood then is that the bayou and its soil, it's from there that the banks emerge and this foundation of education rise. And so our intervention was about those 3 elements of water and the vegetation and its banks, and this piece, this soil emerging from the Buffalo Bayou. So we designed this kind of water feature, a concrete pedestal with a red admixture to talk about this red clay soil, and some of the vegetation, again, speaking to the Buffalo Bayou. And that concrete plinth then really being an opportunity, a device to make a space, again, to provoke use of space, but also to narrate the story of Barbara Jordan and her origins. And something that, coming from that Rio de Janeiro work and challenging the idea of a memorial being this static object on a pedestal, I've become very committed to the idea that when we design with memory in mind, that it should engage and provoke current and future activities and program. So to conceive of this plinth then as a plaza, as an outdoor classroom relative to the library, as a stage for activating the large lawn, and as a play space for kids in the neighborhood. And that when all of those things come together, it really is about fortifying memory into the future. So while all of this is happening, I also had this kind of nagging question in my head about something I read about when I was in graduate school. I know I'm speaking to mostly architects, but I wonder if you all know who Frederick Law Olmsted is. Okay, that laugh makes me think yes. He is considered the father of landscape architecture. And I heard in passing in my 9th year of higher education that he traveled the slave states and wrote about the conditions of slavery for the New York Times. I heard about it in passing, but I just kind of, being from the South, I really wanted to know more about Frederick Law Olmsted's relationship to the South and if there was a relationship to his practice of landscape architecture. Olmsted, again, is the father of landscape architecture. He designed Central Park, which is America's first public park. His firm would go on to design 5,500 spaces across North America. So I make the argument in a forthcoming book that no one person, no other singular one person has actually shaped the way America looks more than Frederick Law Olmsted. So as I mentioned, he was commissioned by the New York Daily Times and wrote contemporaneously. He also came to Houston, which was not quite the bustling metropolis that it is now. but he does spend time here. One of the things that was important to me to establish was in the historicization of the profession and of his biography, he is described as being a wayward youth, didn't know what he wanted to do, and these are some, he was a writer, he was an activist, and these are just some timeline. This is a timeline of some of those key dates. And largely the story goes, he then became randomly a landscape architecture, invented it, and then he designs everything. When we look at the timeline of those key dates, what emerges to me is that these aren't discrete chapters in his biography. In fact, he's doing both at the same time. He's traveling the South, he's writing about his reflections, and he's inventing a profession, if we take the story as it is, of landscape architecture at the same time. I took some time as a research fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, to go through his personal letters. And in fact, he is referencing a lot of these key dates, historical events as they're happening, to inspire what he believes is landscape architecture. There was already landscape gardening and landscape design, but landscape architecture in its formulation was something different. And this is important in my view to understand why it is different. In particular, I'm very intrigued by the period from 1860 to 1861. He steps down from overseeing his construction of Central Park and instead goes back to writing a singular volume that would be known as Cotton Kingdom. He wanted to publish before the first shots fired at Fort Sumter, and he did, 6 weeks before. This is a map that he made in that republishing in 1861, and with a man named Daniel Goodloe, abolitionist from North Carolina. And they took 1860 census data and spatialized it in this spatial analysis. This is a tool and a method of analysis that we all do today, but it is not new. And this was a form of argumentation for him. This summarized the thesis of his book, Cotton Kingdom. That being, he wanted to challenge the economic argument for slavery. In areas where there were larger concentrations of enslaved people, he noted that the economy is actually faring poorer than other regions. That is the heart of the book, and he used this spatial analysis technique to make that case. And for me, to this point, already being really intrigued with the potential role of an architect to be an advocate, understanding that this is a part of Olmsted's journey starts to embolden me, and at this point I can't stop researching him. So I retrace his steps throughout the South. This is his itinerary. I largely followed the seaboard slave states, which are the states that he writes about in that singular volume. And he comes back from these travels and sits down to submit a design competition entry for a Central Park of New York. And that is where he sits down for 4 months and translates these reflections from the South into landscape design theory and ultimately landscape design. And it's encoded in the design of Central Park and consequentially in public parks across North America. I'm writing a book about it, so I won't go too much to it, but there are a lot of elements of circulation, of edges, that are embedded in this, for better or for worse. But the assertion being that it was really his reflections on the plantation South that propelled this profession of landscape architecture via Central Park. I'll just share a few images from across the sites that I visited 165 years after Olmsted did. Among the many takeaways from retracing his steps was the ways in which landscape architecture has been used as the tool or the weapon for untelling the stories that Olmsted himself wanted to tell. Architecture is usually seen as the bad guy, like, oh, they put a building over it, But landscape architecture is complicit in obscuring histories, recasting them, and I believe that landscape architecture has to acknowledge its past in this way. This, for instance, was an African burial ground when Olmsted visited. This is in Savannah, Georgia. Today, you know, people enjoy the park. I spent a couple of days just hanging out here. And, you know, most folks that I talk to, they know Frederick Law Olmsted. And you know, when I shared with them I'm here because he came here, you know, they kind of freaked out. And I had to tell them, yeah, he's here because there are thousands of people buried beneath your feet. And it's known as Whitefield Square today. Olmsted took time to transcribe the headstones of the African and African descendant people buried here. And they are not here. But it's this, you know, normatively good design, great landscape to be in. And so what does landscape architecture do? What can it do to tell the stories that the founder of our profession sought to tell? So transitioning now into where our practice is today, where Studio Zewde is today, and the ways in which, you know, these inquiries and the emboldening that this history of Olmsted has really, you know, given me. I wanted to share a couple more ongoing projects of the office. This one is Mander Campus. It's a 22-acre portion of Fairmount Park in North Philadelphia. This is a neighborhood that's about 2 miles north of downtown, and the high school here is known as the most violent high school in the United States. Lots of vacancy, lots of unemployment. So the park here is the space to get away. This is the space of safety, of coaching, of, you know, intergenerational relationships, first kisses. You know, we heard about an incredible contribution this park has made to the lives of these people. This is the current conditions of the park. We thought our role then is to elevate the physical conditions of the park to be in union with what it means to people. Our work started by looking at archival images, and that really opened people up to sharing with us their connections to this place. One of the community members gave us this poem. It says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And that idea really became the challenge for us. Can we design a monument that breathes? We started our community engagement on the project without drawing a single thing. We said, you know, this place is already so special to people. Let us celebrate the park the way it is. This neighborhood is known for having the best block parties in Philadelphia. So we had a block party. We hired, you know, caterers from the neighborhood. We had rappers perform about what they love about Mander, t-shirt making, and it was also a site analysis tool for us to see how this park functions when it's activated. People think they're at a party too, you know. There are all these prompts around and ways to celebrate Mander, but we are actually getting important information. At a certain point, we switched out the barbecue plates for aerial maps, and the 150 partygoers were divided into 6 large groups where they made collages about what they love about this place. And so each one of the 6 groups sent a representative to the front, and we got to listen to how people express their priorities and their love for this place. And the kind of organizing of the 6 groups also, you know, broke down the kind of tension between designer and resident. Now the residents are really fighting with each other about what to put on this collage and what's important. And that's important for us to hear too. And so we analyzed those 6 collages, not as a kind of one-to-one translation, but what are the large strokes? What are the orientations? Where are the program concentrations? And how do people orient themselves to this place? And we found that there were 3 things emerging across the 6 collages. One is activating this residential edge all the way to the north side. Second was bringing people into the heart of the campus. And third was creating a clear and legible circulation system around the park. And so, you know, long story short, what was valuable about this process is being able to communicate clearly, here were your inputs, here's our interpretation of them in these 3 design, you know, guidelines for ourselves, and here's how that forms the structure of a landscape plan. And we even developed a memory plan. In other words, all of the memories that you're sharing with us, our investment in this park is not about displacement, but it's rather about anchoring those traditions in this park, fortifying them over time. And so being able to communicate that and share that translation of the design with folks went a long way in the process. John Coltrane grew up on 33rd Street facing the park for a period of time. And on the left is a sketch of the mathematics of jazz music that he made. And we translated that into a paving pattern that stretches across the paving, across the park, and becomes a kind of armature. You see it here in this rendering, an armature for wayfinding and inscriptions about people from the neighborhood. We heard a lot about family reunions, so we developed this whole kind of grove for family reunions. If anybody knows Meek Mill, who's a rapper, he's he's from the neighborhood, so that's why he's in this rendering. And at the heart of the southeast corner where people already hang every day, that is their aesthetic of being, we kind of reshaped the topography to form this bowl. And from the plaza, this heightened, elevated plaza, the view is really meant to capture the idea that the community is the spectacle, the community is the breathing monument. And so we have this water feature with the words of that poem about the breathing monument inscribed there to literally reflect this sentiment about this place. And finally, I'll speak about Graffiti Pier, also, oddly enough, in Philadelphia. And this is a project that we are, so Mander, just to put a bow on that, has recently gotten, it was also kind of more in this advocacy realm. We were commissioned to do a master plan, and we've been working with the community ever since 2019 when we developed that plan to get funding. And I'm happy to say that the first phase has been funded, and we're now moving towards documentation. For Graffiti Pier, we similarly are actually moving into the first phase of construction documents. And this, again, starts with a kind of seed of engagement. So this is a 6-acre site on the Delaware River. So this is Graffiti Pier, this long one, Pier 18, and then Pier 20, which is, you see, kind of crumbling into the river, and a little bit of the upland areas, about a 6-acre site. Our research here revealed a couple of things. I mean, one is, we didn't know this, but graffiti was invented in Philadelphia. They love to tell me as a New Yorker, and now New Yorker, that it was invented in Philly and not in New York. But it was invented in the 1970s at a time when coal was declining in the state of Pennsylvania, which meant that sites like ours, which was a coal chute, were made available to the evolution of this art form. There was one pattern break, which was in 2010, when Instagram happened, and this site, emerged from the obscurity of the street art scene to becoming the most Instagram spot in Philadelphia. This became a liability for Conrail, that owns the property, and they started to engage our client, the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation, in imagining what the future of this place could be. It's this beautiful, dynamic, open-air street art museum. Any day that you go, it is a different place. And so you can imagine when graffiti writers started to hear that landscape architects were on their way, they got a little upset at the idea that this would become, a park? And so what we pitched to the client in terms of a mode of working in this context was to say, the people that have imbued so much beauty in this place have been criminalized for their use of the site. And as a function of that, they work, there's anonymity that's really important. They have government names and day jobs. And so we're going to have a public engagement effort that's not public. We're going to tap into this underground network. And so we had a public engagement arm that was really, it's still ongoing, talking to adjacent neighbors, but we really developed a pretty strong network of street artists to engage in the future of this place. We had a beer tab from the client. We were just meeting people at bars, one-on-one. We got representatives sent to us, anonymous emails and phone calls. This is one of the bars that we met some random street artists at. One of the most important things to communicate to folks and really change the narrative was, in 25 years, this site is going to be inundated by high tide alone, daily high tides. We're not talking about storm events even. And so getting involved in shaping the future of this place is actually the way to save Graffiti Pier. So, we were like, this is a Save Graffiti Pier project. And that really mobilized the street artists to get involved. Across these disparate conversations and phone calls and emails, we were asking everybody the same question. What is the best thing that can happen here? And what is the worst thing that can happen here? And we mapped all of those responses that we got on this kind of spectrum. And what we found was the best thing is that you don't touch it. And the worst thing is that it looks like a park. So we have nobody to blame but ourselves as landscape architects for this. But within that, we also started to find some emerging themes. And again, we came back to folks and said, okay, here's what we really see emerging from that. We have to ensure the continuation and expansion of art, keep the site vegetated and passive, make it safe and accessible without looking at safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. So we were able to, throughout the process, share how the site plan was engaging each one of those four elements. And for instance, keeping it gritty, I was asked a follow-up question to one of the graffiti writers, what does it mean to keep it gritty? And he's like, rocks and mud and water and plants. And it started to become clear that the ecosystem of graffiti really intersects with the historic ecosystem of the marsh that was here. And so we proposed removing the bulkheads and introducing an intertidal landscape, which means that as the tides rise, the site can actually shift upland and inland over time. And it also allows a way for artists to engage with the rising tides and witnessing it themselves. So this is ultimately the site plan that we're moving forward with now towards the first phase of construction. To share a little bit more about the process, at midpoint of the project, we took some early renderings to the graffiti writers and street artists, and they actually tagged onto the drawings their feedback. And so we went through this process of decoding those tags and working their ideas back into the design. So you see things like where there are pioneering species, we're introducing bioretention swales and some additional art follies, which were additional surfaces for making art effectively. There's all this adjacent urban development coming, and so creating this kind of green frame of planting on either edge to really offer that sense of a buffer that's already there. We developed a custom suite of site furnishings to design based off the language of a Jersey barrier, which we see all over the site. But again, more additional surfaces for making art. The pandemic hit while we were doing the first phase of work. And so we said, how do we keep this communication going? And the graffiti writers and the street artists are talking to each other through zines. So we made a zine with them called The Voices of Graffiti Pier to share the last design drawing updates. So they were taking images of the graffiti that they were writing, and we were kind of going back and forth in the page layout between their work and the design drawings. As a kind of language. This is, looking at the archival drawings in the 1923, the railings from the original structure, which we thought were really beautiful. They're not up to code, but we thought that this might be the key to making something safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible. So this is a before image, and after, what you'll see in this series is how a light touch can cost $28 million, and that is, shoring up the structure, but also instilling this kind of adaptation into the design. So you see here that marsh, the intertidal landscape here, and the new railings. This is before and this is after. Again, that's the translation of what we see as emerging vegetation and translating that into a new bioswale, upgrading the surfacing to make it ADA accessible, but really being selective about removal of invasive species and really keeping the character of the site. This is before and this is after. Similar thing where we're basically interpreting that existing vegetation into planting beds, but holding robust and sustainable plant palette, full of species that are kind to a diverse ecosystem. and then upgrading the surfacing, but really keeping the structure of what's there. This is before and this is after introducing a kind of shade garden and the shady patch under the trestle and our site furnishings. This is before and this is after. What you see at the bottom is coal from the history of the site. And they told us, whatever you do not remove the coal because it's so kind of symbolic of going to Graffiti Pier, coming home with coal all over you. And so the client, bless their hearts, they heard this and they're like, fine, I guess we have coal on the site forever. And but you see these shade trees and site furnishings and the introduction of our planting palette. This is on top of one of the trestles, and the street artists and graffiti writers, they said, whatever you do, don't make it look like the High Line. So we did want to make it ADA accessible. People are climbing off of chunks of concrete that are swinging by rebar. So we cut out this. We cut out of the concrete roadbed an ADA accessible ramp. But again, with the same language, that 1923 railing, having this netting so that it's up to code. And the plants are really sedums, grasses, the paths are gravel, and the seating is chunks of concrete to really not shift this ecosystem of graffiti, but allow it to be resilient to its future. And Pier 20, that pier that's kind of falling into the river, it's really not used for anything now because of it, its structural condition. But we've been working with Sherwood design engineers on developing, shoring it up structurally with a new seawall and some shoreline protection, and using that to expand the programming. The graffiti, so graffiti and street art has a whole system of curation that exists out in the world that we're not necessarily privy to, but curation and management is something that already happens a lot in the culture, and so they wanted to use graffiti, this Pier 20, as a way to effectively introduce programs themselves. So you see here the new, taller seawalls and an opportunity to, with the rising tides and this marsh vegetation, allow for the art that they make to dialogue directly with these rising tides. And you see, this is like looking back to the coast, that marsh connecting to Pier 18. So it's quite a stretch of work across the journey that we've been on. I'm really excited about where we're at right now, which is a lot of these large-scale projects are getting built, are breaking ground this year. And so, this aesthetic of being is really remains a big part of how I think and how we're working and ultimately how we're building. And I'm really excited to continue to take these inquiries into the next step and evaluate what we built and build off of that. And I think, the notion of memory and identity then really becomes not about the past but about the future, and I hope that some of that work reveals that to you. And to think about Houston as weird of a place as it is, as a place that is an idea or that is multiple ideas, and it's an incredible place to be working and thinking and learning and teaching, and it's so rich for all the kinds of questions and inquiries that that I'm interested in myself. Thank you very much.